Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, Trans History and Historicism in the Digital Age, with Jen Manion and KJ Rawson. This is our inaugural LGBTQ plus history event. We welcome those of you who are here with us in Antiquarian Hall in Worcester, as well as those joining us from around the country and around the world on YouTube. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Scott Casper, and I'm the president of AAS. Our mission here is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources AAS has been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world and right here in Worcester to use the collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. This program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, our YouTube page following the live stream. We are delighted that you have joined us this evening. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help us keep this work going. Thank you. And for those of you who are here with us in person, we have a small exhibit in the reading room. If you'd like to look at that after the program, it's an exhibit of materials related to the topic of tonight's program. October is LGBTQ History Month, and we're pleased to host two scholars who've done significant work in the history of gender and sexuality, including research right here at AAS. So I'll introduce them both now, and then they'll have a conversation about this, and then we'll open it up to everybody. KJ Rawson is professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at Northeastern University, where he also directs the Humanities Center. He works at the intersections of the digital humanities and rhetoric, LGBTQ+, and feminist studies. Focusing on archives as key sites of cultural power, a topic very important to us here at AAS, he studies the rhetorical work of queer and transgender archival collections in brick and mortar and digital spaces. Rawson is founder and director of the Digital Transgender Archive, which is an award-winning collection of trans-related historical materials, and he chairs the editorial board of the Homosaurus, an LGBTQ+ linked data vocabulary. KJ was elected to AAS membership in April 2024, and I learned just tonight that the Digital Transgender Archive has just recently received a major grant from the Mellon Foundation, which is phenomenal news to help keep this important work going and even expand it. Jen Manion is a social and cultural historian whose work examines the role of gender and sexuality in American life. Manion is the Winkley Professor of History and Political Economy at Amherst College. They're the author of two books, Liberty's Prisoners, Carceral Culture in Early America, which received the Mary Kelley Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic in 2015, and Female Husbands, A Trans History, which was a 2020 finalist for the Organization of American Historians Levine Award for the best book in U.S. cultural history, and it was also recipient of the British Association of Victorian Studies Best Book Prize. Manion is the co-editor with Nick Syrett of a forthcoming two-volume series, The Cambridge History of Sexuality in the United States, Volume 1, Early America, and Volume 2, Modern America, which has an expected publication date of 2025. They've been actively involved in countless efforts to advance LGBTQ+ history, including the American Historical Association's Committee on LGBT History, the OAH Committee on the Status of LGBTQ History and Historians, OutHistory.org, and the Gail Cengage Learning Sexuality and Gender Archives Project, among many others. I will also note that Jen Manion has a strong relationship with AAS that goes back quite some time. They were a Peterson Fellow here back in 2005-2006, taught our undergraduate American Studies seminar in the fall of 2018, and were elected to AAS membership in November 2020. So we're delighted to welcome both KJ and Jen back to AAS for this conversation. I think we're going to start with KJ telling us a bit about the Digital Transgender Archive, and then both will join on the stage here for a conversation, at the end of which we will open it up to those of you who are here in the audience, both in Worcester and on YouTube, to ask questions and join in the conversation. So welcome to you both, and take it away, KJ.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the warm hospitality of being here at AAS. It's such a joy to always be here. So thank you for having us. And I just want to thank in advance Jen for being willing to be an interlocutor for this conversation. So I'm actually just going to take about 5 minutes or so as a quick intro to the project, just to sort of give a sense of where the project came from, what some of our aims and goals are, and then we'll shift gears into conversation. So the Digital Transgender Archive is a project that I got started way back when I was a graduate student. I was trying to do research on trans-related history, and I was having a really hard time finding significant collections of trans materials. There's lots of research barriers that make it especially hard to find documentations of gender transgression throughout history. But it was something that I realized was a bigger and structural concern. It wasn't just my limitations as an individual researcher. So I started to brainstorm, how can I help to address this problem? And came up with the idea for the DTA. It was in conversations with other researchers and archivists who also shared my passion and concern about getting trans history to be more accessible to more folks. So you can see here from our mission that accessibility is central to the work that we are trying to do with this project. Not only because it's in the middle of the text and bolded, but really that is the purpose behind the whole project. We do that by providing access to digitized historical materials, so physical materials that we have created digital surrogates for. And we also collect some born digital materials and information on archival holdings that have not yet been digitized. It's always important to note that what we have is just a small little tidbit of materials that are already being collected. And of course, what is being collected is just a small little bit of what could be captured to document gender transgression throughout history. So how do we decide what to include? This is our official scope statement. And this is a very active statement. So it's something that we turn to time and time again to decide what to include in our collections. So you can see here from this description that we move away from transgender as an identity category and instead treat transgender as a practice of transing gender. So what that means is that we don't just focus on people who wave their hand in the air and say, I'm transgender, this is my community, because of course that would really limit our scope, right? The term itself, transgender, the first time I was able to find it in print is 1965, and then it gained widespread usage in the late 20th century. So what that means for an archival context is that it would completely cut out AAS and other partners. And it would also just limit our collection scope in pretty dramatic ways. So instead, what we do is we collect a really wide range of materials that document transgressions of gender in whatever time and place those transgressions are happening. So in some ways, there are definitely moments in our collecting where we open it up quite wide, and people might give us a bit of a side eye and say, why is that in that collection? But really, our aim is to bring things together to document a really wide range of history that can resonate with transgender expression. And we do focus on pre-2000 content, though. So that's something that we try to really stick to. In part, it's because the availability of the internet changes dramatically throughout the 90s, and particularly by 2000. And also, the term transgender really gains widespread circulation by the end of the 1990s. So we try to focus on the harder to find materials, the physical materials, because that's really what we can contribute increased access to. So if you're not familiar with the site, you can find us at www.digitaltransgenderarchive.net. The project is actually getting into middle age, at least for a digital project. So we are almost turning the corner on our 10-year anniversary, which is a pretty exciting milestone. It launched in January of 2016 at Holy Cross. So I was a faculty member at Holy Cross when the project was started. We are a post-custodial archive in that we don't have any physical collections. So it's sort of the opposite of AAS in many ways. We have no physical footprint. Instead, all of our materials are drawn from our collaborating institutions, and we have 84 different partners that we work with from 10 different countries. So I send a lot of emails. We do digitization in lots of ways. Yeah. Do you need it to be louder? Yeah. Is it possible? Okay, I will try to project more. I think a lot of the microphone is for the remote audience.
Oh, I see.
Okay, but I'll do my best to be louder. Sure. So we digitize in lots of ways. Sometimes our partners do the whole process for us. Sometimes we go to the archives and do it ourselves. And other times we bring materials into our lab and digitize on site. We currently have 11,500-ish items that we have digitized and provide access to, which again feels both a tremendous accomplishment, but also really small in the context of all of trans-related history pre-2000 globally. And then the last thing I'll mention is that our collections do date back to the 16th century, but the vast majority are from the second half of the 20th century. And part of that is because we have really focused our resources and efforts on materials that are created by people who are transgressing gender norms. The further back you go, the more common it is to have accounts about people and not authored by them. So I just wanted to pull out two quick highlights here, which are from the AAS collections. These are two examples of the kinds of things that we look for the earlier back we go. So this is just a very brief clipping from 1870. This is the kind of thing that when you find it feels like a research miracle, right? Because again, especially in this example, you're looking at an intersection of a Black person who is also transgressing gender norms. And from the 19th century, these are quite difficult to find. The other is an imprint from a book. And the Chevalier Dion is a very famous historical figure who is actually quite easy to find documentations of. So it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition there. And you can see how the name of a particular person comes to then stand in for a gender transgressive practice throughout the late 19th century and even actually quite into the 20th too. So I think I'll leave it there. So that's just the, again, very quick introduction to the project, but then we can transition into conversation. Thank you. Was that any better volume-wise? Okay, we'll keep trying.
Well, thank you, AAS, for hosting us. I also am just so grateful to be here. I've always had also such a warm welcome feeling and have had the chance to really, dig in and do some, what to me, felt like at the time, unexpected, really important, finding, unearthing documentation of the trans and queer past in the collection here. And when the Chevalier de Leon is mentioned a lot, like in the articles about female husbands. Mm-hmm. So there's just, one of the ways that the press just fixates on a figure and then keeps using, past trans figures as reference points to help readers understand and make sense of what's happening in the present. So I'm so happy to be here with you and to have the chance to learn more about the DTA and also just to bring it to more people. It's when I first found out about it, I just couldn't believe such a resource exists. As someone who's dedicated their life to the study of the past, it never would have occurred to me to create an archive. Mm-hmm. I go to the archives to find what's there. So I would just love to hear more about your process and, how you came to think that documents from the past were important and that was something that you yourself would conceptualize a framework for and build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. When I first started dreaming about the DTA, it was actually a really niche project. I started thinking about it as a collection of finding aids, which would really just be like information about what was held elsewhere. So there wouldn't be any digitized content. And really there'd be like you and I on it all the time, and probably like 10 other people who we already know, right? Because it seemed unfathomable to me to navigate the ethical concerns, to navigate the copyright concerns, to get enough archivists who wanted to collaborate. And so I started with this list of like 6 archivists that I knew. And I just kind of reached out to them and I said, would you have any interest in working on this? Absolutely. Like they were like really like geared up to do it. They started sending me like pictures of content because they wanted immediately to post more resources. So I started trying to navigate all of those complexities. Like, okay, how do we get around copyright? What are the issues there? And then beyond that, so that was like the legal hurdles, but perhaps more pressingly were the ethical hurdles, right? A lot of folks in the DTA are still alive. And if they're not alive, their memories are still very alive and their loved ones are alive. So how do we navigate how to respectfully collect and represent their histories? So I started collaborating with a lot of those archivists to help answer those questions. And then it kind of got out of control from there. I did not mean to have 84 collaborators less than 10 years into the project. But archivists are really excited about getting their materials out there, and they want to use resources like the DTA to help address some of those barriers that they are seeing with access to their collections. Did that fully answer the question?
No, that was great. I appreciate it. I want to come back to the, framing, from one of your earlier slides about how you define transgender and what that means to us, and what that creates, the possibility for an intellectual and political community, but then also potentially what that forecloses and how you navigate that tension.
Yeah, so for people who aren't all that familiar with queer and trans histories, once you go back, even anywhere before the middle of the 20th century, it gets completely entangled, right? So gender expression and sexuality are not seen as separate identities. And so anyone who's doing research into these paths, you really have to navigate in very complicated ways to understand what's being talked about. And Jen, I actually think your work is a perfect example of that. Trying to really appreciate and uphold the nuance that's happening. Like, what are people actually up to? Because the ways that they're being talked about is often, you can even read into it and see, I bet they're not talking about themselves in these ways, right? So part of what we try to do with this project is bring all of these threads together so that contemporary researchers can see the resonances that are not always clear within archival contexts. The other thing that it helps to do is it helps to connect collections that are really far apart. So, our collections span from Victoria, British Columbia, down to South Africa, throughout Europe. And what that does is it puts together puzzle pieces that you might need to spend years and many thousands of dollars to try to actually get to all of those collections and bring together. And if we only collected under transgender in a narrow sense of like, this is people's chosen identity, we'd really be very limited and narrow in that. But it also means that sometimes the care that we take in setting up the materials as not being about transgender people gets lost. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen like news coverage and they'll pick something out of the DTA and be like, there's a trans person. And you're like, no, that's not a trans person. It's just someone who's transgressing gender norms. And we don't want to make claims to every person who's in the collection as being trans. Lots of them are. Lots of folks are self-identified, or they would have identified as trans had that been available to them. But we really get caught in that back and forth between having a legible project with transgender in the name of it, but yet trying to uphold that kind of complexity and nuance that not everyone in the collection is transgender.
It's so hard, because I feel like I get asked similar questions, and I'm always trying to convince people that my understanding of transgender is different than what circulates, in terms of, well, no, transgender is just only, a clear identity. There's a trans person and they self-disclose that, and what you're saying isn't that. But I think one of the connections, I think, between your framing and grappling with that and my work here is when I came to AAS, I had an NEH fellowship in 2013, and the way I pitched the project and the way I understood it at the time was to historicize female masculinity before the end of the 19th century, when it gets conflated and consolidated with sexual deviance, right? Because I knew the 19th century, it's just like a gender party, disaster, chaos, right? Like there's so much rich, really interesting stuff happening. And when you stumble upon those records, like people aren't being denigrated, and they're not suspected of being gay just because they're gender nonconforming or because they're like assigned female and living as a man. Like something else is going on there. And I wanted to understand that. And so that's why for me it was important that I didn't even necessarily think I had a trans project, because to me, calling it trans felt like a closure and not an opening at that time. And I wanted to create an opening and like see, my argument about the past and maybe even also about the present is, we have so much more in common than we have different. And I was always less invested in having some kind of clear answer about someone's identity. I thought, well, that's like the least interesting part of this.
Yeah.
How are they living? How are they expressing themselves? What are they doing? Who loves them and why? How do they move through the world? And so I would love for us to talk and hear your thoughts about people, who are critical of our work for saying, oh, we are throwing all of these people into this, very modern trans identity and trans umbrella, and they don't fit there, and we're erasing women and whatever. Like, what are some other? How can we think our way out of that? Like what else is going on for us when we make that decision? Because I know we're actually not invested in erasing women from history. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's really on point. And I like the metaphor of the opening and the closing, right? I think that's a really helpful way to approach this. And that's very much our intention too, is the opening. I'm really sympathetic to the contemporary need for people to latch onto an identity and to find a very kind of positivist lineage of that identity throughout history, especially in such an embattled moment for trans folks. So I'm super sympathetic to that. And yet I'm often like, but let's keep this open, right? Let's not try to impose in an anachronistic way these ideas about identity, because even the idea of a singular personal identity is itself a modern construction. So we have to step so far outside of our current understandings of not only gender and sexuality, but the notion of the self, right? And how the self relates to others, that once we go back into historical research to really sit with the materials and understand what they're saying about their time and place, we have to really take a significant leap from our current understandings. And I'm sure we don't ever successfully do that, right? But that's the intention. For us and as a project, we're always trying to push those boundaries. But there's also a bit of it where it's sort of like it when you see it. The transdar, the gaydar argument, right? But there's a certain type of materials that sometimes we'll say, no, we're not going to spend a lot of time processing those types of materials. So for example, Shakespeare plays. They're performed. It's a theatrical context. Women are not allowed to perform, so there's tons of cross-dressing all throughout Shakespeare. We could technically collect that, but that's actually not necessarily a gender transgression, because it is the norm in the context in which these performances are happening. So for us, we're always trying to evaluate in the moment, and it does sometimes come down to a lot of personal discernment and decision-making. But it's kind of hard to explain that sometimes. But I'm sure you've experienced similar things with your research, right? Where you find something, you're like, oh yeah, this is different.
Well, it's so funny because I was thinking similar to before the Shakespeare example, which I love. I think that's like a great example because people always want to talk about that kind of stuff. Oh, I totally just lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. Oh, here's what I'm saying. Trans people deserve history, right? So it's like I want myself, you, our friends, our community, like we deserve history. Like people, so on the one hand, like we are doing that very consciously. We're not doing that.
Right.
And at the same time, I'm saying this isn't only trans history. And maybe it's not even trans history.
Yeah.
Can we have like all of those things
At once.
at once?
Oh, you're good. Don't worry about it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the intention, right? That's the goal. But I think sometimes this is what gets us into trouble as academics, right? We like to be like theoretical and hold overly complicated ideas. And sometimes someone just like wants to read about a cool person in history.
Right.
And we try not to get in the way of that. One of the things that we do on the DTA is that all of our web content, we try to write with a 12-year-old audience in mind, which for academics is not easy.
Right.
Because we're always showing off our big words and all this, right? So we actually workshop our static content with young teenagers and get feedback from them. And now, thankfully, I have a daughter who's 11, so she's almost at the age where I can just start workshopping with her. But it's really helpful because we want to think about if accessibility is central to our mission, who are we accessible to? And that really is important because as much as academics love to live in the theoretical space, like this resource is not really designed with academics in mind.
Right.
And so making sure to like lower those barriers as much as we can.
Right. I believe so strongly in the power of history and the power of our stories. And so one of the reasons why I love this, and I'm so grateful to you and all of your students for building it over the years, is just making this incredible record accessible to anyone for free, online, anywhere. And I've always believed that if more people had access to the truth about our lives and our communities, that they would be more accepting and more understanding. And especially since we're living in this moment where one of the lines that's used in order to argue against trans rights is that being trans is a new phenomenon, that this is something that young people do, that comes in the 21st century. So what is the potential for this to change the world?
I mean,
and how can we make it happen faster?
How can we make it happen, right? Let's do it tonight. Yeah, I mean, I'm an educator at heart, right? I think you might be too, right? Where we want to like help people to learn things. And I deeply believe that when people can learn new things, when they can be exposed to new ideas, it is a transformational process. And so that's a big impetus behind the DTA, is just getting things out to people and helping them to learn that, no, this is not a fad. It's not a new phenomenon. This actually is throughout human history, we can find documentations of people transgressing the norms of the gender of that time and place. So I think it really is helpful to give people access, but of course, who's finding the content, right? Who's taking the time to read through it? And part of that is helped by media coverage and documentaries and all kinds of interesting places that are using our materials. But I think, continuing to get it out there in new ways is something that we're talking a lot about. So right now, there's a group of folks working on a DTA podcast. Okay, great. Let's try that as a new mechanism to get things out there. But given the current political climate where trans people are very much embattled and targeted, this education is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of safety and the livability of trans lives. So I don't think the stakes could be any higher.
Well, one of the ways that I use this is with my students. And it's very powerful. And I know that you had mentioned that students play a huge role in building it. So I wonder if you would tell us more about the role of students in building the DTA.
Yeah, I started this project when I was a faculty member at Holy Cross, and which a lot of people ask a lot of questions about. I'm happy to talk more about that too. But one of the reasons that it works so well there is that students are super engaged and they are ready to work alongside faculty and alongside each other towards something beyond themselves. And it was just such a great opportunity to start working with one or two students. So I mean, those early days, the mission statement, the scope, that came about from sitting in a seminar room with a couple of students going, what should we collect? How do we describe that? How do we get through all these nuances of gender? And from that moment on, students have been involved in every step of the project. So we now have a lab where there are 15 students every semester who work on the project. So every single item that you see on the DTA got there because a student processed that item. So what that means is that they get, say, just a clipping, and it gets to them, and the student has to look at that and say, all right, how do I input this into a database? What are all the things that people would be searching for and would want to find this item from doing that? So it's really incredible that students get to do this work of like taking an object and making it searchable and findable. And we've had the experience a number of times where the students will process something in the lab, and then within a week, it'll be on a national media site. And they'll be like, wait, I did, that was me? It's like, yes, that was you. And it's really amazing to see students kind of inhabit that role of being stewards of history and feeling like they have the power to transform the information landscape with respect to trans folks. And of course, it's also a good lesson in proofreading. Because if you put the wrong date on something, right? You put 1906 instead of 1806, all of a sudden that is entered into the historical record as that. And let me tell you, like, no one on the other side is thinking critically about it. They're just like, oh, look at this thing from 1906. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. So we really work a lot on like how to ensure the quality of the database, how to make sure that we're like representing these materials, not only in accurate ways, but in ethical and authentic ways too.
Awesome. I want to take some time to talk a little bit about the AAS collection, since
Sure.
we've both done some work here. And I don't know, can we show the slide from the exhibit that I have with some records from AAS? Did that make its way through the children's literature? Okay, if we can, I just, because one of the challenges is for early Americanists, anybody working really in the pre-20th century, it's really challenging, even though there is a lot of gender diversity in the records. And so when I was here for 6 months searching through the newspapers and the dime novels and the books, it was really wonderful. And Laura introduced me to the world of children's literature, and there's some amazing stories of trans kids in the collection. And then also one of my co-fellows who was here introduced me to the Eliza Leslie stories, in which she, writes some prescriptive literature really about children who are, pushing against the gender roles that are expected of them, and how their peers and their parents navigate that and really, taunt them and punish them and bully them into conforming to gender norms again. I think those were in the 1830s. So there's not a ton for early people, but there is some. And I know, oh, here we go. So all of these, could we have, can you click on the tomboy who was changed into a real boy? Because that was
Yeah, one of my favorites.
So every once in a while, when you are directed to something, sometimes these texts can offer play an outsized role in our understanding of what was going on at the time, because there's not a lot of it, but it's really precious. Mm-hmm. And I know you had a team here who also did some research. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, or anything that they found?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've worked with a wide range of students here at AS over the years. So initially I was working with students from Holy Cross, and we did a few experiences of summer research where students would get some funding from the college to come and do a sustained research project here. And then since I've been at Northeastern, I've used some grants to support our continued collaborations with AAS. And that has meant sending graduate students here for long periods of time. One of them is now a PhD student who's looking more at AAS collections for her own research. So it's kind of fun to see, too, how they find these threads and then they want to continue that research. So a lot of what we've tried to do in working with AAS collections is exactly what you've been doing, too. It's like finding these little threads, and it's in unexpected places. So it'll be in these kinds of like moments where you're like, oh, I didn't think to look at the children's literature collection. One place that is a little bit more expected but has been more bountiful than we knew going into it was searching a lot of the serials. So the Police Gazette is... Need I say more? The Police Gazette. Yeah, and so of course you're going to get a particular slant on history that way. The other thing, like Bureau of Indian Affairs. Some really interesting hits in there about colonizers who are encountering indigenous gender, right? So again, it's not the easiest thing to find, but it's, some people in rhetorical studies talk about archival research as truffle hunting, right? And that feels pretty apt, right? There's a bit of like magical experience where you're going through and you're looking for things. But yeah, we've sort of found things all over the collections at AES. There's not been one particular, type of material or one particular collection that's been like, oh, this is it. Instead, it's been scattered throughout. Was that kind of your experience as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about, women or people we might say assigned female at birth who are living as men and doing it for a day, a week, a year, 10 years, and having all these adventures. And so, trying to figure out, like, I feel like I haven't even published on a chunk of the research that I did, because it's just hard to know what to do with it. But I wonder if this is a good time also for us to kind of reflect on the whiteness of trans studies. There's been some real scholarship on that topic where so many of the archives that we rely on for this research are disproportionately, overwhelmingly telling the story of white American history. And I know your project had a grant or has a grant actively to challenge that and change that and, put together a more diverse and expansive racial history of the trans past.
Yeah, it was, the first few years of a project, you're just so enthusiastic about it. You're just like collecting all the stuff that you can, and you're like, this is great, everything's going well. And then all of a sudden you look down and you're like, wow, we have an almost all white collection. Great, right? So it's not the intention, but the path of least resistance led us to collect the most privileged factions of trans communities and people who are transgressing gender norms. So for our early collecting, what that meant is that we were often processing materials about people who were cross-dressers. So people who lived 95% of their lives in one gender, and then sometimes on weekends or once a month would express themselves in another gender. Typically, these are folks who are assigned male at birth and who would cross-dress as women periodically, who lived all of their lives as men, but would just have these moments, and these would last for decades, right? So it's a sustained identity. And what we found is that a lot of these cross-dressing communities in the second half of the 20th century had the resources to create publications, to create really sustained documentations of their activities, and to have really robust activities. These are folks who can afford to rent out blocks of hotel rooms and occupy spaces in ways that have sticking power. And so then we get lots of documentation. So we have access to all of these papers and event flyers. And of course, in terms of ethics, it's much easier to process these materials because folks are assuming feminine names that are disconnected with their legal names. So again, what happened is that we started accruing all of this content by self-identified cross-dressers who were predominantly white, who were predominantly wealthy, and who had access to create and preserve their history. And so we realized that if we just continued with this business as usual, we would continue to proliferate that problem. So I was successful in getting a grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources to do a 3-year initiative where we have done nothing but process materials related to trans people of color and experiences related to people of color transgressing gender norms. So we're in the 3rd year of that grant now. I was about to say second, but that's wishful thinking. We're in the 3rd year of the grant. And we've worked with 10 partners for that project, and AES is one of those partners. And it's been really hard work. It has been hard to identify materials, but at the end of the grant, we will have digitized around 30,000 pages of new documentations. So it's a super successful initiative. We're really excited about what the outcomes are going to be, but it has been harder than I even anticipated.
That's incredible. Yeah. You know, I just know from my work here in the newspapers that when there are references to trans people of color, they're much less likely to have last names. Or accurate names, that then you can reconstruct a life and track through other kinds of records. And the same is true for some female sailors and female soldiers who were on the books under their female names. Because, you know, the story will, you know, be something like, you know, and then Mary Jones, you know, stripped off her dress and cut her hair and hid it behind a bush and, you know, joined a ship. And then you never know what Mary Jones's name became. You know, you just know where Mary Jones started. But some of those practices, especially, you know, around African American records in the newspapers, there's lots of references to people, but like without the context or the data that you need to really tell the story.
Yeah. And I would say, too, that we see that a lot in Indigenous histories, that it's an extension of colonization to misspell people's names, to misrepresent them. It's a way of historically erasing individuals and then sort of claiming ownership of their lives and their stories. And so it makes research on them deeply problematic. And of course, like what is being said is also almost always deeply problematic, right? Yeah. So trying to navigate these kinds of materials can be a really significant challenge in a project like this. Because we don't just want to put them up on the website and be like, here you go, here's history. Our project is not bound by objective standards of the archival profession. So we do add things like content warnings. And sometimes in those content warnings, we will say, this is a racist and transphobic depiction. And that'll be the first thing that someone reads when they encounter an item on our site. Because we want to sort of frame that for people, because our goal is to educate folks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping, I'm guessing, I'm sure that some people now like want to dive into DTA and do some research. And I'm sure nobody knows the collection better than you. Are there certain areas, certain holdings, things that are new, things that have been there a long time that you just know nobody is looking at, but would be amazing like sources?
Are you asking for everyone or for you? Next research
and
project.
And specifically before 1880.
I mean, just hypothetically. You know, I think some of my favorite collections on the DTA are the photograph collections, because they are just so charming, especially not the staged ones, right? There's some photos of like Marsha P. Johnson celebrating birthdays. And, you know, so there's just like people living their lives, which I just love. I can often steer people away from the things that are the sort of crime reports and the sort of arrest records or things like that. But I get really excited to see the kind of like everyday traces of people living their lives authentically. There's also some just like fun stuff, you know, there's like some clothing and some pins you saw earlier. There's, you know, so there's like the everyday tangible objects. I know AES has lots of fun objects too. So I think those are also fun to take a peek at.
And I know we were talking earlier that it's like hard to measure impact and, are we actually educating people? Like, where is this landing? Like, who is interacting with it and to what end? And I wonder if you do have any knowledge of any moments or articles or books or, inspired changed lives of young people or old people. Like, do people write to you and tell you about these things, and would you share a story or two with us?
Yeah, I mean, that's the best. Like, that's my favorite part of this project, is having people reach out and email and say, this resource saved my life, or this resource allowed me to find myself. It still surprises me that in this moment where transness is being talked about all over the place, that the Digital Trans Archive becomes that source of resilience for people. And it just, it makes it all worth it. So I think those are my favorite stories. I also had a friend recently who went to a trans studies conference and was joking with me how many times they heard the DTA mentioned. And it got up to 22 for a 2-day conference, which I was like, wow. So it's really great to hear it, of course, in academic spaces as well. But it also, my partner and I were watching a documentary recently, and it came up in the credits. And I was like, oh, all right, great. And I have no idea. And so often it's being used in all of these places where it just surprises you. So that's a really fun part of it, too.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I think this is probably a good time to open it up to questions. If anyone in the audience in person or online has a question or a comment, we would love to hear what you're thinking.
Thanks, Nan. It's a bit of a mess. I'm Susan Schulten. I'm a current fellow here. And both of you have touched on this, the tension between the presentism, for lack of a better word, and your constant desire to keep it, as you both said, open. And I wonder if either one of you can talk about your own intellectual sort of evolution in that. In other words, you must constantly run up against that conflict, right, in your own work. And I know this is a little bit amorphous, but to make it more concrete, in the DTA in the early months or years, was it your show? In other words, you were grappling with that alone? Were you working with collaborators where you were trying to figure out that mission statement and trying to figure out those definitional things? That part seems really rich to me.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I actually think Jen's response might be more interesting than mine. But I would say that, I worked very closely with students on that part. But I took a cue from queer and trans studies, which has done that movement between identity and practice very routinely, throughout, the last few decades. But there's still that moment when you're collecting and there's just the trans recognition where you're like, oh no, you got to stop yourself. And you're like, no, that's not me, right? But it sort of resonates with you in these deep ways. So I think that just trying to be constantly attentive to that dynamic and that kind of affective response that we have when we encounter historical objects. And we try to put it all on the website and keep things separate, but often it really just also comes back to the personal researcher experience. And just trying to check yourself on it. But there are moments where I think that conflation can also be an interesting place to play in, right? That it's not just something to sort of push away from. But I'm curious what you would say.
We're living in this period of transition, right? I mean, some of us were trained as social constructionists, gender is a social construct, it's all made up. And we really believe it. And then another discourse, which is very salient right now, is that gender is my interior identity, and it's my strongest sense of felt self. And how do we hold both of those things? And I teach different trans documents in different classes, and without any engagement from me, I can't stop it. There, students will immediately begin their own sorting. This person was really trans, this person wasn't. This person was really trans, this person, wasn't. And it's, so it's very much an intellectual and political and generational like shift. Like if my starting point is that gender is made up socially in relationship, and their starting point is that gender is, you know, an interior sense of self. You know, I like to think that that's like a really I think I tried to write my book at that intersection, and you know, but I don't know that that's as functionally generative a dynamic space in most people's minds or in even academic work anymore, in a way that I feel about it, or we feel about it, or you.
Or people in the 1820s.
Yeah.
We have a question back here on YouTube.
Yes, hello from YouTube. Courage Collins student from RIT was looking to possibly explore documenting the idea of digital trans identities. I was wondering if projects like that are considered to be added to something like the DTA.
And by digital, I'm curious if the person means internet-based or digital in the more expansive way. So I'm guessing internet-based. There are some really great projects that actually collect on queer and trans archival, internet-based connecting and community building. The digital, what is it called? The Digital Queer History Project is a good one that I point people to, and they have really phenomenal collections of like old Usenet spaces and other kind of like chat boards and things like that people would connect on. So I think that trying to track like digital trans histories in those ways is a great thing. For us, it generally falls outside of scope because we really try to stick to the pre-2000 scope pretty strongly. If it occurs before that, we do actually do a little collecting in that area. So it's something that folks could collaborate with us on. Thanks.
Hi, I'm BJ Lillis. I'm a fellow here. I have a question about the sort of ethical thing that you raised a few times. And mainly, I guess what I'm wondering, and largely out of my own curiosity, is whether people reach out to you who are in the archive and how those conversations go. And also thinking about what you were just talking about kind of the younger generation having some different conceptions than people who are maybe coming from a little further back. But are you also having that conversation going back even another generation with people who might be like in your archive as like the subject of the archive, but then they're around? So I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the unexpected benefits of this project is that I get to spend a lot of time talking to older trans folks. And that's been great. I don't know why I wasn't thinking about that when I started the project, but it turns out that they're our best collectors. They have a lot of memories, they have a lot of documents, they have a lot of things to share. And so I've spent a lot of time, working with folks. I do get a lot of kind of cold emails from people who are represented in the collections, and they run the gamut. So my favorite ones, of course, are like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe I found myself here. Or like, you have this photo of me from 1987, whoa, or whatever. So that's kind of fun, right, to get those responses. I will say that the number of takedown requests have greatly increased over the past few years because the political climate has changed. Even folks that I have had longer conversations with who gave their consent to be named and very public on the site have had to recant that consent because of direct attacks against them. To take one example, someone from Maine recently reached out to me and said, hey, there was a flyer for an event that I did in Provincetown in 1992. It included my legal name as well as my femme name, and that hasn't caused any problems for the 7 years that it had been on the DTA. But someone from my hometown just found it, made hundreds of copies, and plastered it all over the small town that they live in as a way of sort of, harming them. They were opening up a new business that they were trying to shut down. So this has real individual economic harm, right? And I hold on to that. And that is a real challenge also to think about researcher needs, right? Because we can have a policy where we strip every name off of every object, but that's a policy of closeting too. It's a policy that suggests that trans people should be ashamed, that we need to be in the closet, that we can't be out. And I don't want to have that policy, right? That I don't want to rest in that space. And yet we also have real potential for real world harms to people. And so it's something that we are actively navigating on a daily basis. In fact, this year, that is sort of the theme of our year, is that we are taking another pass through our collections for harm reduction. And we have a harm reduction guide. We have all these policies that we follow, and then we have to go back to the policies when the political climate shifts. So that was a bit of a long answer, but it's something that occupies a lot of our time.
Wow, that's so important. I'll just do a short answer to the second part of your question. No, I think, some of the long 19th century cases that I've worked with, like Joseph Lobdell or Alan Hart, are actually tremendous because how they understood their gender and sexuality, how they expressed it, how they wrote about it, how other people saw them, is changing over time, really in relation to the way the context is changing. And so they're such powerful stories, they're such powerful people, but it also helps us, to me, it also helps illustrate maybe a more complicated tension between, gender is external, gender is internal. So that's like the best part of this, is working with those records.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks so much. That was a great talk. I was wondering, you earlier mentioned that you're using the two definitions of, transgender. Like you have the as a definition as an identity and then as a practice. I was wondering if there's ever any kind of confusion between using those two different definitions, and whether you think it might be better to use a definition of practice for as like one definition for everything. Has that idea ever come up or anything like that?
Well, I'll just say I think the definition is really from the origins of trans studies, right? So the Stryker, Moore, Carra, essay in WSQ in 2008 offers some of these early expansive ways for the growing field of transgender studies, how we should define it and approach it. And then Susan Stryker also puts this in her transgender history book, which was also 2008, I think.
That's a busy year for Susan.
It was a big year. And she's the one who uses this language, and it says, we should approach transing as a practice, as a move, to do a lot of different things. One thing was to disrupt this idea of a binary, that one is one and becomes another. This like a rigid binary transition, just to kind of open up and recognize that for most trans people, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And so just to kind of make space for people. And also for us as academics to have some way to, engage with something that beyond an identity that's interior that we can't really access, right? So like, what is a transing practice? That means moving away from the gender that's expected of you. So one of the ways that I understand, I'll be curious to hear if yours is similar or different, is, that's really a move in the founding years of transgender studies as a field to help us have like a shared working definition that would really like enable knowledge, right, in this way. But that also reflected the desires of a lot of trans people who were sick of, of a binary. But then we're all in, the shadow of medicine and, the medical classification and categorization for a long time, that the core idea, in order for you to be seen as legibly trans and get access to medical care, you have to say, I believe I was born in the wrong body. I have an interior sense of self that is different. And that like it's literally like, if you don't say those words and you don't write that down, you can't get access to any gender affirming care. So we didn't get to set the terms of this. Medicine really did. And, some early trans activists who went along with or agreed with that. But I understand my work is coming in, with trans studies, and I'm so grateful because this idea of transing as a movement, as an expression, as an expansion, has been so transformative for the field of history, because it's allowed us to go back to all these old records and say, oh, now what? You know, we don't just have to accept that this person was only cross-dressing. You know, we can kind of blow this open and have a more nuanced, specific way to grapple with this record. And I don't have to worry about this person's sense of identity, which I'm never going to get access to in the archives anyway.
That was a great answer. I'm not going to add any more to that.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Allie. I just began my dissertation fellowship here. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really exciting, and I'm very excited to look at this archive later tonight. I had a question about the scope of the materials in the archive. I work in museums, so material culture and non-archival sources are sort of one of my mainstays. So I'm just curious, what I know you mentioned like some clothing and some buttons, but what is the balance? And like, are you looking to expand on that front? Are you working with institutions that have, you know, larger material culture collections?
Yeah, as you could probably guess, material artifacts are often something that queer and trans communities are particularly drawn to account for, you know, gender and sexual experiences and pasts. And so I think that completely neglecting material objects is really missing out on an important component of queer and trans history. The problem that I face with it as a collector is that we don't do it the materials justice. So oftentimes you'll go in and you'll see like a binder or some t-shirts or whatever, and they're just like someone's, like, it is not a good snap. Like it is like, whoop, you know, and we have the technology now, right? We can do this like amazing imaging, and I'm sure that some of the digitization that happens here is actually much higher quality than a lot of what we have on the DTA. But I almost feel bad putting some of the material objects, as we have like created these like poor digital surrogates for them online, because they could be so much more. So that's almost a grant in and of itself, would be to work with some of our collaborators that have these great, you know, physical artifacts that we could then think about scanning and providing digital access to in a much more robust way. I think about this especially in the age of like touchscreens and like what it would mean to like digitally touch artifacts and like engage with them in this new space. But of course, like immersive technologies too, you know, augmented reality, immersive reality, like there's all these spaces that we can imagine, you know, bringing these materials into, and we're certainly getting there, but the DTA has not even wandered in that direction yet.
Please join me in thanking KJ Rawson and Jen Manion for this conversation. I will say on behalf of AAS that it is a privilege for us to be a partner in this project, and we look forward to that continued work and to nurturing the work of scholars who want to do this kind of study. It's really important to us because it makes what has been collected here for more than 200 years accessible in ways that has never been accessible before. And there are stories, human stories in those materials that need to be told. And I am grateful to both of you for telling those stories, whether it's through the DTA or through your individual research. Encourage more people to come and do that work here at AAS and find those stories. We have a program coming up next Thursday that I want to tell you about. It is the author Jack Rakove. He'll be giving our Robert C. Barron lecture on his Pulitzer Prize winning book from the 1990s called Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution. Another topic that is important for our own day as well as for its historical context. We have lots more programs coming up in the coming months. Please check them out on our website, americanantiquarian.org. I want to thank all of you who've been here tonight, whether you're here with us in Antiquarian Hall or watching on YouTube. Please recommend this to your friends. It'll be on our YouTube channel in the coming days. We wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Jen and KJ.